So let me do a quick introduction to Dr. Robinson, our next presenter. Dr. Robinson is a research psychologist at the Naval Medical Research Unit in Dayton, where he studies issues related to human performance in the aeromedical domain. His current research interests include the role of cognition in pilot spatial disorientation, which is something I've experienced many times as a former fighter pilot for many years. The performance indications of respiratory challenges in the cockpit and coordination behavior among critical care air transport teams. Dr. Robinson earned his PhD in human factors psychology from Wright State University in 2017. His graduate research focused on expertise in the medical domain, including contextual effects on decision-making in the emergency department and ways to measure performance during surgical training. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Robinson.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank you for letting me brief today. So today I'll be talking about some ongoing efforts to utilize real-time physiological data in the cockpit to support pilot performance. I should caveat my talk just by saying, I've been involved in research looking at the performance side of a lot of the issues that I'll discuss, but I'm not an engineer. And I'm not directly involved in any specific development efforts for some of the systems that I'm talking about today. So everything that I'm discussing today is just based on kind of my own observations and experiences, but I don't necessarily represent or speak for any sort of decision-making authority. Next slide, please. Standard disclaimers there. Again, these views are my own. Next slide, please. And next. So discussions around human-machine teaming often focus on how to optimize the machine agent as a teammate to handle tasks or augment the human operator's performance. It's most often discussed around cognitively oriented tasks, like monitoring tasks, problem-solving tasks, decision-making tasks, things like that. And so we focus on things like fatigue or distraction or workload when we're thinking about how to support the human. And I don't want to minimize those at all. I mean, as we've just heard, they're all very relevant and they're very important to the DoD, but they also aren't the only things that we need to be concerned about. So you have to consider physical tasks and environmental factors like altitude effects, extreme heat or cold, sleep deprivation, physical exertion, and potentially even exposure to things like hazardous substances in the environment. And so all of these factors can degrade performance. So an additional need for this problem is not exclusively just how to augment the human as a collaborative partner, but when to be more of, I would say, a guardian angel and maybe step in to warn the user that their safety or performance is at risk or activate compensatory mechanisms to help try to preserve the safety and performance of the operator. Next slide, please. And tactical aviation is an especially interesting domain because almost all of those physiological and cognitive threats can be present in some form. Pilots breathe from a life support system that may malfunction, and they could be exposed to things like hypoxia, excessive work of breathing. Temperatures can be high or low, especially on the flight line in different locations around the world. Many pilots sometimes limit their water intake before flights to avoid having to urinate in the cockpit. And so you have to think about things like hydration as a concern. Then, of course, if you get into high tempo flight operations, fatigue is an obvious risk factor. Pilots can be subject to things like high G forces. And then, of course, just the various tasks that are associated with the mission can impose a high cognitive burden. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, as of now, there aren't any deployed systems to monitor the pilot and warn them when they're starting to become physiologically impaired or degraded. So basically, the human has to act as their own sensor. And so we're in a position where you have to wait for the pilot to become degraded and then wait for that degraded person to recognize their own impairment and then hope that that person can take corrective action while they're impaired. And so there's this lack of real-time physiological data has contributed to some issues of pilots reporting feeling unwell or impaired in flight that we've been referring to as physiological events or PEs. And this issue has affected multiple platforms, including things like the F-18, the F-22, and the jet trainer, the T-45. And that lack of in-flight data has really made it difficult to proactively prevent these events in the first place, and it's also made the subsequent investigations after the fact more challenging. Next slide, please. And the DoD is, of course, very aware of this gap, and they've been actively developing in-cockpit physiological sensors for several years now. And they're getting close to the point that they are able to provide reliable data in the flight environment. So the technical aspects are getting close to being there. And as those efforts mature and get close to deployment, though, the question isn't just how do we get good data? It's, we have to think about how to use that data to drive interventions that help keep pilots safe. Next slide, please. And so the main question is, how do we draw a boundary that proactively identifies impending impairment before performance starts to decline? So, if you have too many misses, then the system really isn't doing much to improve safety. But on the other hand, if you have too many false alarms, then you get into trouble the other way. So you're likely to run into issues where pilots will ignore the warnings because subjectively they feel okay still, and they think the system is too sensitive, or they'll believe the system and they'll start scrubbing and aborting missions unnecessarily, which is also something that we can't really tolerate. And so it's really kind of a difficult needle to thread, even under the best of circumstances. But we found that it's particularly hard when you're looking at the kinds of issues that we've seen in flight. Ideally, you'd be able to draw a direct and consistent link between what's happening in the environment. And for these purposes, when I say environment, I'm mainly talking about the breathing system and the respiratory environment, the physiological responses to those exposures, and then the performance changes that are associated with that change in physiology. But unfortunately, what we've seen is those links are actually pretty hard to characterize. And I'll spend the rest of my time going over some of the issues that we've identified over the last few years. Next slide, please. So one issue with developing physiologically based interventions is that physiological data out of context is not necessarily useful. So, you're a lot more concerned about a heart rate of 160 if the person is sitting still than if they're running. So you have to know what the environment is like before you can really determine whether something is abnormal or not. And part of that is relatively straightforward. So, the pilot doesn't have any sensors to monitor them, but the aircraft itself is pretty well instrumented. We can tell things like what the cabin pressure is, what kind of pressures are in the breathing system, what G-forces are being experienced, and things like that. So it isn't necessarily a perfect picture, but we do at least have some information about that already. Go ahead and advance, please. And so another piece of contextual information is not just what the pilot is exposed to physically, but also what they're doing. So different flight tasks require different amounts of physical and cognitive effort, and that can change things about pilots' breathing patterns or eye tracking data, for example. And then pilot behavior and respiratory activity can also interact with their aircraft life support system to affect certain parameters. Next slide, please. And so assuming you have access to the aircraft data and have at least some sense of what task the pilot is actually doing, you also have to determine whether that physiological readings that you're getting are typical for that context. And so here we start to run into problems of individual variability. So we have some real world instances of PEs where two pilots were in an aircraft, a two-seater aircraft. They both got the exact same exposure from the breathing system, the life support system. One pilot had an issue and the other pilot felt perfectly fine. And so we have, a lot of data at this point illustrating that kind of variability that I'll talk about in a minute. But then another question that we really don't have much data for is whether individuals respond consistently to different physiological challenges. So we don't know if you'll respond to an exposure tomorrow the same way that you would respond to it today, or what factors may predict changes in those responses over time. And so it becomes very difficult to define normal or to say that a particular environmental exposure is concerning, either at the population level or for individual baselines, when people have so much variability in their responses. Next slide, please. And so here are some examples of the types of individual differences that we see when we give participants different respiratory challenges. The next couple of slides show data from a study that we did that examined the effects of breathing through a flight regulator with just different levels of gas supply pressure into the regulator. So in this first chart, we have supply pressure on the x-axis. It's kind of obscured there at the top, and minimum mask pressure that we measured in the mask on the y-axis. And so negative values basically indicate that the gas flow into the mask wasn't keeping up with the flow that the participant was trying to inhale. So it's basically kind of creating a vacuum and sucking the mask into their face. So when we supplied the participants with 10 psig into the regulator, most people did just fine with that. There really wasn't much issue for anyone. But then as we kind of gradually lowered the pressure down to 6, 4, or 2 psig, we start to see a spread in how people responded. Go ahead and advance, please. So the people above that green line more or less did fine. They didn't see too many large negative mask pressures because they basically adjusted how they breathed. They started taking longer and slower breaths that let the regulator keep up with what they were trying to do more easily. The people below that line really struggled. So they tended to try to inhale harder, try to force gas through the regulator, and that led to these larger negative pressures in the mask. And so we see variability in people's behavioral responses to a respiratory challenge, even before we start to look at the physiological effects of them. Next slide, please. And then we also see variability in how things like minute ventilation responded to those same exposures. So overall, when we look at the sample as a whole, we didn't see any changes in people's minute ventilations as we reduced the pressure to the regulator. But we did see individuals with relatively large swings and inconsistent responses. Several people increased their minute ventilation, just how much gas they're moving through their lungs per minute. As the regulator inlet pressure dropped, one person decreased their minute ventilation. And then some people did both, kind of depending on what experimental condition they were exposed to. And so it isn't necessarily the case that the manipulation had no effect at all. It just didn't have a consistent effect across the individuals in the sample. Next slide, please. And then we see similar trends with the end-tidal CO2 values from the study. Again, if you look at the sample as a whole, there weren't any significant changes. But individual people did have some notable increases, and then some had notable decreases. And then a lot of people basically stayed the same. And I'll also point out here that those horizontal dashed lines in the figure represent that zone of what we would typically consider to be kind of normal levels of CO2. And so at least in this sample, we would consider pretty much everybody to be slightly hypercapnic, slightly elevated levels of CO2. But none of our participants showed anything that was acutely alarming or reported feeling, subjectively bad. And so values outside the norm don't necessarily indicate an immediate problem in this environment when you're trying to think about how do we alert pilots to potential risk. Next slide, please. And then, of course, ultimately, the main goal of any effort is to alert pilots or implement an adaptive system that preserves performance to make sure that the pilot is able to fly safely and complete their mission effectively. And so we have to identify what physiological disruptions may affect the mission, either because the pilot feels ill, they physically feel bad, or because they can't maintain their performance anymore. But unfortunately, we really haven't seen consistent links between the physiological data, subjective symptom reports, and performance. Next slide, please. And so I'll illustrate that just with a couple of case reports from another study that we recently completed. This study simulated the breathing profile that was produced by the aircraft during a real-world PE, just to see if we could replicate what the pilots reported in the lab. The first set of plots is from subject 6. That blue line represents the control condition, and then the red line represents the experimental condition where we kind of expose them to that breathing profile from the flight. Compared to the control condition, this person's carbon dioxide levels decreased there in the top plot, and her work of breathing and breath rate both increased. Breath rate is there on the bottom plot. Go ahead and advance, please. But despite respiration, being objectively affected by the experimental condition, she actually reported difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, air hunger, and limited mask flow as being worse in the control condition. Go ahead and advance, please. And her performance on a psychomotor vigilance task was also not affected. So this person had really one of the stronger physiological responses to the exposure, but subjectively, she still felt good and her performance was fine. Next slide, please. And then this next set of plots is from subject 9. This subject showed lower breathing frequency and lower minute volume during the experimental condition, which is there in the graph on the top for minute volume, and then higher end tidal CO2 values, which is the plot there on the bottom. Go ahead and advance, please. But he didn't report any subjective breathing difficulty in either condition. Advance, please. And then his performance on that psychomotor tracking task was actually more affected in the experimental condition than almost any other subject in the sample. So both of these participants were objectively affected, as far as their respiration during the exposure. Their respiratory patterns, their CO2 levels were different, but their subjective impressions didn't consistently align with that. And only one of the two had any sort of notable performance deficits, even though both of these subjects had some of the more dramatic physiological responses to the exposure. Next slide, please. And so really, I think we have kind of two main issues as we try to press forward with developing useful sensing capabilities to help, protect pilots and augment performance. I think the first is that it's really difficult to identify what a normal physiological response looks like for a particular environmental condition and whether performance is likely to be affected by that. The PEs that we see in the real world tend to be very idiosyncratic events. They seem to be tied to very unique contexts and kind of individualized risk factors that we're still trying to untangle a little bit. And we're trying to make alerting decisions for individual flights and missions. And so we may set an alarm or an intervention threshold that's based on population data that doesn't necessarily apply to the particular individual in the cockpit at that time. That person may be relatively resilient or they may be particularly vulnerable. And so, maybe the system is set up to look for increases in CO2 when this person typically shows reduced CO2. And so these physiologic events that we see are all unique. And so, we have a big risk of misses or false alarms depending on how you set the parameters for that system. And so we need a way to take, to be informed by population level data, but to make individualized risk assessment decisions without negatively impacting overall readiness or individual mission completion unnecessarily. And then, so the other big issue is just how would we validate any prototype system in the real world? We don't have any historical data to try to use because we've never had physiological monitors in the cockpit before. And so we can't look back to see if there are any commonalities across events because we've just never recorded one in real time. And it's also hard to replicate these effects in the laboratory. So at this point, I've done several studies investigating this issue. And we've managed to induce some symptoms. We see some interesting trends in the data. But we've really only had one instance, I would say, that seemed to truly mimic what the pilots seem to report in the real world. And so despite the relatively large impact that PEs have had on flight operations, they're still relatively rare. It's only a handful out of every 100,000 flight hours. And so it would take a long time to observe a sufficient sample of real world events to really draw any firm conclusions about how well we're predicting these events with any system that we develop. And so if there's any way to kind of speed up the validation process, I think that would be tremendously helpful. Next slide, please. And that's everything I had for my technical slides. I think I've left a little bit of time for some questions. And my email address is also up there on the slide if there's anybody who'd like to reach out offline.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. So any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, or you can always raise your hand and we'll let you ask the question in real time. While we're waiting to see if we have any questions from our participants, do have a question for you, and I don't know if it's something that you have looked at or not, because I think it's been a couple years maybe since it's really been highlighted. But so much of the 5th-gen fighter community, has had a lot of press about issues when it comes to the onboard oxygen generation system and issues with breathing in the cockpit with those aircraft. So I don't know, how much, I guess, maybe experience or any research that you've done as far as that goes to try to help solve some of those issues.
Yeah, I know there's been a big push to adjust things like maintenance schedules. I know, I think it's the T6, but I'm not 100% sure. They're getting an upgraded OBOG system to hopefully mitigate some of that. There have been some engineering changes for things like different valve assemblies. They're doing things more on a proactive schedule rather than kind of fly to fail type of an approach. And collectively, the efforts seem to be paying off. I know the rates of PEs have gone down considerably over the last couple of years. And so I think it's taking kind of a holistic approach of trying to be proactive from the engineering side and the aircraft side to make sure that it's performing properly within specifications. And then also on the back end with the more on the pilot side to try to make sure that we're monitoring physiology so that if something does go wrong with the life support system, that we can hopefully identify it more quickly without having to wait for the pilot to become impaired in the first place. So.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, when it was one of your, I think it might have been your first or second slide where you were highlighting some of the issues that the pilots face. I was chuckling to myself because I think I have experienced, or at one time subjected myself to all of those things, especially, of course, when I was younger. And you feel like you can conquer the world. So flying a little dehydrated or something like that, seems like no big deal when you don't realize, though, potentially how it's affecting your overall performance, in the cockpit. So that's excellent.